And welcome back. We are going to continue our review, this time diving headfirst into learning about loops. Now, if you recall, when we were discussing loops, one of the big things here is that loops allow us to repeat a certain action over and over again until a condition has been met. Now, Java allows us to do this with 4 different loops, and we've talked about these in the previous course. There is while loops, do while loops, for loops, and for each loops. Now today we're just going to focus on reviewing while and for loops. If you want to review one of the other loop types, you're more than welcome to go review your previous notes or look them up online for implementation. So let's start first with just the regular while loop. A while loop is going to first test a condition, usually a Boolean statement, and then it's going to execute the code before looping. Now while loops will loop until either the Boolean has been set to a value that does not meet the loop condition. So for example, if we do while true, and it's going to run until we have a condition that changes that Boolean to false, well, that's going to cause that loop to exit. Or more commonly, the value of the loop no longer meets the comparison statement, so x is less than 5. Let's say you have a thing that is just adding 1 to x. X starts at 0. Well, if you add 1, eventually that x will equal 5. Well, 5 does not meet the condition of being less than 5 because it's equal to, so it would then exit that loop. Remember, we can use any primitive type such as int, char, double, bool, etc. in order to meet or use a loop condition. And if we look at this in a quick example here, alright, the first of course is what is known as an iterative loop. We have while num is less than 0, system.println, the value of num is plus num. And we're just doing num plus plus. So you'll notice here that num is incrementing inside of our loop. Now, one thing that you will notice is that we didn't declare num here in our loop. So this is most likely declared outside of our loop because we want to be able to use that value elsewhere. Now, here's an infinite loop. And you'll notice the big thing here says while true, system.println looping. All right, there's nothing here that's going to stop this loop from keep going. All right, there's no iteration like num plus plus. It's just while true. Now, we could add a conditional statement here that maybe has some kind of action that's going to eventually change it to a false. Or the other thing we can use is we can use the break command to exit out a loop when it is a condition that we specifically are looking for. Now with a for loop, the big thing to remember here is that there are 3 parts. We have our initial value, we have our Boolean expression, and we have iteration. And here's a quick header example. We have for int I equals 1, I is less than 5, I plus plus. The I equals 1, of course, is our initial value where we're starting that loop at. I is less than 5 is our Boolean expression. And I plus plus is telling me what is my value of iteration. Now, note that our initial value does not necessarily have to be initialized inside the loop. I could have said int I, and I could have said that out here before this for statement. However, there is some danger in necessarily doing so by not making it local to that loop. Because when you put it outside your loop, remember, you do run the risk of somehow modifying that value. Or if you, like, let's say, have a bunch of for loops in your code and they all use the value I, well, they could all be affected by whatever the value of that previous for loop was. So that's why a lot of times when we look at for loops, a lot of times those int I, like here, your initial value, is initialized here within inside the loop so it stays isolated. Now, your iterations, right here, I++, are typically either plus plus or minus minus. Sometimes we do have weird cases where it's like I plus 2 or things like that, but most of the time it's I++ or I minus minus, and remember that you do not put a semicolon here. Now, if we look at this with an example, we will notice that in comparison with our while loop, we do still have a very similar structure here, but our iteration is no longer inside the loop. It now happens up here in the loop header, which is fine. So it's system.println, the value of num is plus num. If we look at the infinite loop, all right, it's the same thing here. We have a looping command, but notice here it says int value equals 0, value is less than I, or less than 1, excuse me. And so because it's less than 1, well, and we're doing minus minus, well, it's always going to get smaller, so it's never going to meet this. Now, I will say most of the time, if we're going to have a situation where we have infinite looping, and we're purposely doing that into our program design, we most likely will not use a for loop, but instead we'll actually use a while loop because we can do something like while true, and we don't have all this extra pieces of code to have to keep track of. Now, just some quick closing notes about loops themselves. Infinite loops are loops that never end because their conditions are never met. As we just saw with our for loop there, we started at 0 and we were trying to get to 1, but we were subtracting each time. And so we will never fulfill that loop. But as I've already alluded to, there are times when we do want an infinite loop. Think about, for example, if you are running a game. You may not want that game to end until certain conditions met, so it's effectively all going to be contained within a loop that's going to keep things going until those conditions are fulfilled. Now, loops, of course, are subject to their own set of errors, the most common of which is an off by 1 error. This occurs when your conditions are set up wrong, and so while the code looks okay, it's not going to give you any compiling errors or anything like that. It won't produce the desired result that you want your code to do. Now, some of this can, of course, be avoided by using equals equals or not equals in our loop conditions. All right, it's fine to use these in like an if statement or something like that, but a lot of times when we're looking at our loops, we actually want to use less than, greater than, less than equal to, or greater than equal to, because it helps avoid those off by 1 errors. Now, if we need to break out of a loop for any reason, and I've already talked about this a little bit. If we have, for example, let's say that infinite loop again, we have our game, it's running infinitely, or maybe it's just a finite loop, and we just want it to, let's say, run for 100 iterations, but if a certain value is found, we want to get out of that loop early. So, for example, let's say we have an infinite loop, and it's just going to keep processing user input until the word shutdown has been typed. Well, we can use the break keyword in order to exit that loop. However, since we don't want to break that loop in the first iteration and only when a condition has been met, we're going to place that break instead inside of a conditional statement. Alright, so here I am in Eclipse again, and I have, of course, some sample code. Now, if you look at this already, you might notice there is 2 different loops here. We have a while loop and we have a for loop. This one says while count is greater than negative 10, greater than or equal to, excuse me. And we're using this count variable up here, and we're just simply printing it out. And with our for loop, we have I is equal to 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus, and we're simply just printing out the value of I. Now, if you look at this code, you might notice automatically that we have an infinite loop here, and that's because we never iterated this. Quick fix, we can simply just do count plus plus, and now, of course, that would then increase this. But if I want this maybe to count down, I would have to do count minus minus. So now if I run this code, you see it goes down, 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 all the way to negative 10, and we get the value of. But let's just say I want this code to stop. All right, and this is what I was talking about before with a break statement. So I can say like if count is equal to, let's say, 0, then what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to break out of that loop. So when I run this code again, you can see it goes down to 0, stops, and then proceeds to this other loop. All right, we can do this, of course, with other things. So, for example, if I wanted to get user input, maybe inside of here I want to ask for user input. So we'll just have enter a line of text, and I'm just going to do a string input equals kb dot next line. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to check, for example, to see if that input is equal to a certain value. So input.equals, let's do an equals ignore case actually today. And I'm going to have that equal the word, let's just say, shut down. Just like in our example that we saw. So, and we can do this with break again. All right, and it's like if it equals shut down, break it out. Now, one thing that we can do too is, that I didn't mention yet, is we can nest loops. So let's just go ahead and just say, hey, we're going to do this, and I'm just going to nest another loop inside here. So int j equals 0, j is less than, let's say, 3, j plus plus, and maybe I just want this to do something really simple. So for example, I'm going to have, let's just say, it do a print statement. All right, real quick and simple. And inner loops, of course, are very helpful for when we do things like, let's say we want to do a bubble sort, or we get working with multi-dimensional arrays. So if I run this loop now again, all right, you can see here's our loop. And you notice that our inner loop did not show up because it's waiting for us to enter that line of text here. So let's go ahead and just enter a line of text. Let's just put Sunny. All right, and you notice we got our inner loop. Here it is again. Oh, it's looking for another line of text. So let's put dog. And notice it's still looping because it's going to go for 5 iterations. But if I go ahead and put that shutdown command in there, it shuts down. Notice it did not enter into the inner loop because this if statement belongs to this loop. So if I were to have an if statement inside of here, it would simply just break out the inner loop. It would not affect the outer loop.